Our topic tonight is the future of South Africa. Our guest is Ambassador Andre Kilian, the Deputy Chief of Mission, the South African Embassy in Washington. I was disappointed that Mr. Kilian has no trace of an American accent, in spite of the fact that his career has posted him in Washington for an extraordinary amount of time. Mr. Kilian's Bachelor of Arts degree is from the University of Pretoria, his law degree from the Witwatersrand, which he'll pronounce correctly at your request. And he joined the Foreign Service of South Africa in 1972. He was assigned as a cadet, a rank with which I'm familiar in some organizations, but not the Foreign Service, but it obviously implies a beginner. The North African desk. He was then posted to Washington and was there for 5 years as third secretary, second secretary, and first secretary. And then for another 5 years served as personal secretary or private secretary to the foreign minister. And then was posted back to Washington again, serving as counselor for another half a dozen years. And then served as director for the Americas in the foreign ministry, and then as chief director for the Americas, Asia, and Oceania for another several years, before being appointed ambassador of South Africa to Canada, prior to his present appointment as DCM. So his specialization in the United States is extraordinary within the diplomatic corps, and it's my great pleasure to present to you Ambassador Andre Kilian, DCM, Embassy of South Africa.
Mr. Burd, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to spend the evening with you and for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts with you about my country, South Africa. Let me just say that I'm suitably impressed and highly nervous now to know that I'm going to be followed by a foreign minister. But because South Africa is such a special country, I'm sure you will listen to what I have to say. And as far as Westinghouse is concerned and sponsoring the evening, I think it's only but right, because I'm told that South Africa is buying a lot of these little robots from them. But on my own behalf, thank you very much also, sir. Mr. Burd, you've asked me to talk about South Africa's future. And when I think about the future of South Africa, two key words come to my mind. And these are doubtless two words that will govern the progress in South Africa on the road ahead. These words are reconciliation and reconstruction, and they are inexorably linked with one another and intertwined. Without reconciliation among our diverse peoples, and without mending the divisions that bedeviled our past, we cannot hope to start to build a future for South Africa. And without meaningful, and in many cases massive, reconstruction in our country, we cannot hope to maintain and sustain our democracy and our future. As for reconciliation, South Africa, its people, and our leaders have already made remarkable progress, much more so than our critics and even our friends in the international community would have thought possible only a short while ago. The healing process that began in South Africa in 1989 with the release of Mr. Mandela, and then the negotiating process between him and the then President de Klerk, was there for the world to witness on the 27th of April last year, when we held our first ever democratic election in my country. For me, the most important feature of that day was the spirit of magnificent healing and catharsis. Black and white South Africans didn't jostle for a place in the line, while they stood for hours on end in the very hot South African sun and waited. They didn't complain about the delays. Instead, they exchanged greetings, they shared their food, and they expressed to one another the sentiments of hope for the future of their land. There was a sense of mutual celebration of the peace that had descended on our country after so many chapters of turmoil and violence, and there was a palpable feeling of the will to work together as South Africans and to make their country a better place to live in. And then I guess there was a cherry on the cake the day when President Mandela was inaugurated, and when that vast multicolored crowd gathered in front of the Union buildings, the seat of the old apartheid regime, and joined hands in a new covenant to their beloved country. I believe President Mandela set the seal on that day of renewal and healing when speaking in Afrikaans, formerly scorned as the language of the oppressor, and asking people, all people in South Africa, to turn their backs on the past and to start building on the hope and promise of our future. All of this filled me, as I'm sure it did all those hundreds of foreign dignitaries that were present, as well as the millions who watched on television around the world, with a new sense of hope and confidence in the future of South Africa. The confidence of those days are now being translated into commitment, and the main instrument of this commitment to the future is our interim constitution. Your country shares with us the harrowing experience of writing and perfecting, or trying to perfect, a constitution, and like you, I'm sure South Africa will for many years be busy refining that constitution of ours. But again, we've made what I believe was a remarkable and excellent beginning. We have today an interim constitution that contains, amongst other provisions, some 30 principles that will be guiding, in fact will be binding, on the Constitutional Assembly that's now writing our permanent constitution. And maybe I should just put again that permanent constitution, permanent in italics, because I realize that it will be amended in years to come. The permanent constitution, as is the case with our interim constitution, will be the supreme law of the land, binding on all organs of government and prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of race and gender. There is today, and there will be in future, a separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, with checks and balances to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness. There is, and there will be, representative government, embracing multi-party democracy, regular elections, universal adult suffrage, and a common voter's roll. The judiciary is and will remain independent and impartial, with a constitutional court to safeguard and enforce constitutional rights, freedoms, and goals. All South Africans shall enjoy universally accepted fundamental rights and freedoms and civil liberties, and these are protected by an entrenched provision of our Constitution, our own Bill of Rights, or as we call it, Charter of Fundamental Rights. As I said earlier, our permanent constitution is now being written by the Constitutional Assembly in South Africa. This assembly is composed of our National Assembly, the one that was elected in April last year, and our Senate sitting in a joint session. The makeup of the Constitutional Assembly is what I believe, ladies and gentlemen, an excellent example of the reconciliation that's taking place in South Africa. The chairperson of the Assembly is Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. He is the president of the ANC and was a leader of the ANC's delegation to the negotiating process in Kempton Park. His deputy is Mr. Leon Wessels, who also worked during the negotiating process on the side of the NP, National Party, however. And Leon Wessels, in fact, was the Minister of Labour in the then de Klerk government. Wessels and Ramaphosa are working very closely with President Mandela's appointed Minister of Provincial and Constitutional Affairs, Mr. Rolf Meyer, who before he became Mr. Mandela's minister in fact served in the cabinet of then President de Klerk. Mayer's deputy is Vali Musa, a constitutional expert who is quite well known in the United States. And to this team, President Mandela has now added Kobi Coetzee, the former Minister of Justice, and today the President of the Senate, and Ms. Frenigan Wala, ANC member, the current Speaker of our National Assembly. The same kind of remarkable inclusiveness, balance if you wish, is reflected throughout the new national government of, at least the government of national unity. I always find it kind of strange to read that in the same cabinet you would have Mr. Joe Modise, who was, as you may know, the leader of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the army of the ANC, and Mr. Pugbueta, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the old government. If you'd seen Mr. Modise and Mr. Pugbueta in Paris at one stage, you'd have thought, God, keep them apart because they'll blow up the country. Today, Modise as Minister of Defense and Pugbueta as Minister of Energy Affairs, representing our country again abroad, but this time as one team. You would find this also on the bureaucratic level. Here, Mr. Modise has appointed about 2 or 3 months ago as the head of our new National Defense Force, George Meyring. Now, George Meyring was the previous head of the South African Army. About 2 months after Meyring's appointment, he went out and in turn appointed some 1,500 Umkhonto officers to his new National Defense Force, 20 about, or at least 20 of them as generals, about 60 of them as brigadiers, and then colonels and captains. And these people are all serving together and serving our new government. The same kind of reconciliation is to be found in the 9 provincial governments. Natal, and I'm sure you're quite well known, at least Natal's quite well known to you. KwaZulu-Natal, you have the IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party, as the governing party. So the premier there is Mr. Frank Delozi of the IFP. His chief lieutenant, however, is not an IFP card-carrying member, but in fact Mr. Jacob Zuma, who is the leader of the ANC in Natal. And Mr. Zuma now serves as the Minister of Social Welfare in that province. And if you look at our past, you would realize that this portfolio is one of the most important in that province, but also in all the rest of South Africa. So I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that what we have in South Africa today is leaders and administrators who have committed themselves to a non-partisan attack on the country's pressing economic and social problems. As for our problems, I'm not going to bore you going into all of them. You know about these. You know about the ravages of apartheid. You read it still to this day, every day. South Africa will have to build thousands of houses for the next decade or more. We will have to revamp our whole education system and build thousands of new schools. And we'll also have to revamp our whole health system. The cost will run into millions, billions. And it's important for the government, if they were to retain, or hope to retain, the goodwill of the people, to be seen to doing this as speedily as possible. I know there are many critics that question the ability of the ANC, the most senior partner in the government of national unity, to effectively tackle these problems. These critics maintain that the ANC is just another liberation movement. It's not a political party, and in any case, it has no experience of running a country. To them, I'd like to say that the ANC did not emerge from a vacuum to take over the reins of power in South Africa. This is an organization that has a history going back over 80 years to 1912. in recent decades, it fought an effective war of liberation, inter alia by harnessing the forces of peaceful mass mobilization. It also fought effectively on the battlefield, and it was capable of maintaining and running a very effective foreign service, a foreign service that in fact convinced the whole world to boycott the old government. And now, as a political party, it has joined hands with its former enemies in a government of national unity, as I said, and it's already indicated and demonstrated that it has the capacity to govern South Africa well and pragmatically. You would have heard during the election campaign in South Africa about the so-called Reconstruction and Development Plan. That plan has now been turned into the government's Reconstruction and Development Program. When first Mr. Mandela and the ANC spoke about this plan, we heard horror stories, also here in America, horror stories about nationalization, redistribution of wealth, etc., etc., etc. People believed that if Mr. Mandela wanted this plan to work, he will have to inevitably run the economy of South Africa into the ground to somehow try and meet the expectations that he and his plan had created with the masses. Well, Mr. Mandela proved the critics wrong. First of all, he put together a team of fiscally responsible people to run the economy of South Africa. And I'm in this regard referring to Mr. Derek Keys and nowadays Mr. Chris Liebenberg, Ministers of Finance, Dr. Chris Stals, well-known man here in the United States, has just been chosen, I believe, by the World Bank and the IMF as their man of the year, in fact, as our governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa. And then to this team he added Mr. Trevor Manuel and Mr. Tito Mboweni of the ANC. Now these last two gentlemen succeeded at the end of 1993 to convince the likes of the World Bank, the IMF, the G7 and the European community that South Africa is a safe haven for investment dollars and a worthy recipient of aid. In fact, South Africa was put in the top priority list of these organizations. And I'm glad to say that South Africa today is also on the top 10 emerging markets for the United States. And if the Baltimore Sun or whoever is not going to quote me on this, I believe we're in fact on the top 5 of this list nowadays. And then Mr. Mandela, when he unveiled his Reconstruction and Development Program, did not produce that monster that people feared, but again, a fiscally responsible and pragmatic plan, a plan that in fact affects the lives of every South African today. People are asking, can this pragmatic plan actually satisfy the expectations of the victims of apartheid? Yes, I believe so. And I believe so because the expectations, and they are high in South Africa, is however not as unrealistically high as people would want you to believe. In fact, in the last few months, poll after poll that was taken in South Africa showed that the expectations of the South Africans, and we actually are talking here about the victims of apartheid, the black South Africans, are by no means any higher or so off the wall. In fact, they're the same middle-class expectations that many, many governments across the world, in your own government, is facing today. I truly believe that as South Africans, black South Africans, victims of apartheid, as they see houses being built, and they are being built, as they see schools being integrated and new schools added to the existing ones, and they are being integrated, in fact they are integrated, and they are being built, as they see feeding program for children whose parents cannot afford proper food for them, as they see medical schemes now for pregnant women and then for the rest of the people. And as I see President Mandela's presidential lead projects taking off, that they will give a chance to that new government of ours to try and make South Africa that better place that we all hope for. I also have to say that I'm reminded in this regard of the terrible blow-ups that was predicted for South Africa. You will recall 4 years ago when we started the negotiating process in South Africa, people said, forget it, you'll never get anywhere. There is no way that Burd and Modise could possibly sit at the same table. They'd rather shoot at one another. And then when we started our election campaign, people pointed to Natal and the violence there and said, there's no way you could hope to have a proper election. Granted, our election wasn't perfect in every respect, but it's also true that 93% of the population voted, and voted in peace and quiet. That's incredible. 4 days before the election, people said, forget about it. The right wing's going to blow up the country. True, they did blow up 1 or 2 places in South Africa, but yet on the day of the election, there was Mr. Mandela casting his vote without great security. I'm sure you saw it. There was de Klerk doing the same. There were the ordinary people. I believe we're going to prove the doomsayers wrong again, and that we are going to make a success of South Africa. Obviously, we need economic growth to do all these things. People in the front row will tell that to me immediately. But it's also true, sir, that at the moment South Africa is growing at 3.5%, around about 3.5%. That's not enough. But we're coming out of a long recession. And on top of this, I'm very thankful to say that trade with South Africa and investment in South Africa from all over the world, and especially from the United States, has improved remarkably, even dramatically, since April of last year. And it's also good to know that the big economic powers, the European Union, Japan, your own country again, remain committed to the economic recovery of South Africa, and they are willing to underpin that commitment also with large sums in foreign aid where it is necessary. So I believe that South Africa has a very good chance to make it economically. And if I had to believe the World Bank, and I hope I can, then they predict for us a growth rate of over 4% for next year, and then hopefully higher. I hope that the United States and investors from this side to South Africa would make it possible for us to, in fact, have a growth rate of 4.6% and higher, because I believe that's what we really need. Some traders, certainly some investors, and also donors, are unfortunately still uncertain about South Africa. As I said earlier, I believe that most of their fears, like the one about nationalization, will turn out to be mere ghosts. I know one of their fears is that lingering doubt whether the right wing and the left wing in South Africa could be trusted, and whether they would not, in the end, drag us into bloody revolution. As far as the right wing is concerned, first of all, and I'm not blaming the press here, but I think they're getting too much publicity. They're really not worth it in the first place. But in the second place, they don't have the numbers that really should give them that kind of publicity. But I believe that the right wing's wings have not just been clipped. I believe they've been broken. Those brave generals, and you've seen them, the ones that fall off their horses, those brave generals are today sitting with Mr. Mandela, asking him to be indemnified so that they can get on with their lives and can join the mainstream in South Africa. I really believe we should forget about them. They are no longer a problem in South Africa. In any case, not if 90% of the population is behind what's happening in the country. The left wing, their standard bearer, the PAC, only got 1.25% in the election. But I believe what's more important than that is that the PAC after the election joined the governance of South Africa and is today participating in that governance of the country. They're part of the National Assembly, criticizing the government, and in many respects, just 2 days ago, voting with the government to pass certain laws. And as far as I know, and so is it reported by the newspapers, the PAC intend to remain so involved. And then in conclusion, the question I most probably hear most of all these days about South Africa and our future. What after Mandela? Now I have to admit, I didn't even want to think about that. Mr. Mandela is certainly a unique human being, a unique leader, unique in every respect. He's a first in our history, and I have a feeling that he's most probably a first in the history of the world. He has done wonderful things, and reconciliation in South Africa has got Mandela written all over it. I realize that. But it's also true, and Mr. Mandela is the first one that will tell you that the process that brought South Africa from the days of apartheid, from the days of Sharpeville, from the days of Soweto, student riots, from Bishu, days before the negotiating process was supposed to produce our interim constitution, Boy Patong during the negotiating, the process that brought us from those dark days to where we are today is much greater than one single individual, even Mr. Mandela. And that process is not going to disappear the day Mr. Mandela disappears from the political scene in South Africa. In fact, that process will remain for other leaders to take it up, to nurture it, and to take it into the future. And there are, within the ANC and other parties of South Africa, a number of people. Deputy President Thabo Mbeki, Cyril Ramaphosa I spoke about, and many others that I believe are up to the challenge, and that they will be able to lead South Africa into a great and proud future, a future that I believe all South Africans deserve. Thank you for listening to me, and I would be happy to attempt any questions that you would like to fire. The question was about coal deposits in South Africa and economic growth and advancement being synonymous to a certain degree with coal deposits. Yes, indeed, we have. I would hate to quote the numbers, but I'm told that South Africa's deposits run into for years we could use. In fact, I believe we are one of the world's leading coal deposits countries, one of them. And then, of course, we also have a couple of other minerals that we have, which makes us one of the most minerally most rich countries in the world. So yes, the other important thing about economic growth in South Africa, of course, is that our financial and physical infrastructure is pretty sound. We have a good infrastructure that obviously needs to be expanded and needs to be revamped a bit, because we come out of 20 years or more of isolation, economic isolation. But we have it, and we've got a very vibrant business, economic sector that I believe can compete, I wouldn't want to say with the Americans, but certainly with some of the best in the world. I believe all of these would assist us in our economic.
Mrs. Shuford remarked that she's lived in Botswana and has an affection for South Africa, and she's particularly interested in what the current situation is with the police force, which at one time was a problem in South Africa.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Of course, as you know, even during the negotiating process, we had the problem of third force activities, etc., and these were in many instances blamed on the police force, security forces, and in fact, somebody like Judge Goldstone, who's now heading the Bosnia War Crimes Commission, had an independent judicial inquiry in South Africa and did in fact find police or security force involvement in the third forced crimes. But like everything in South Africa, the whole South Africa has been turned on its head or around or what have you. And we do have a new police force, and this police force is made up of the old existing police force and of the security forces within the ANC and some of the homelands, so-called homelands of the past. And of course they've come under new political management, if you wish. But then I guess more importantly is that Parliament has been given oversight on the police force, and that we have civilian policing in the sense that they're civilian authorities that are looking out for what the police are doing. I would like to believe that all those problems that you referred to is something of the past. I think that would be naive. You will still have residual people having that kind of a hangover from the past. However, Mr. Mufamadi, our Minister of Police, Safety and Security, as we call it, just made a statement, I believe, yesterday or the day before, in which he said that he has no doubt as to the loyalty of this police force. Obviously, it's got to be to the new government, who else, but towards the people of South Africa. And full confidence in them, and so has President Mandela. I can't go better than that. Also, one thing, the police are now going out of their way, because in the past, because they were enforcing apartheid rules, they became the enemy of the ordinary person on the street, or the majority of the ordinary person on the street. Police are going out of their way now to try and mold themselves into the friends, difficult as that is. But I believe having some kind of success now where the ordinary population no longer see them as the enemy.
The question was, in what way does the media, print and electronic, contribute to the success which you describe in South Africa?
Yes, the media in South Africa, as you may well know, is independent. It's not controlled by the government. The SABC, certain control, government control in the past, and there's still certain government control to the extent where the government appoints a board to oversee what is happening and to set certain standards. But I think the media has played a very important role, especially in the days of the negotiating process and then the run-up to the election when temperatures were high and there was some violence. And then even after writing about what President Mandela said. If you read, for instance, the media about President Mandela, he's got an excellent press, which is not surprising. But they concentrate, obviously, on when he goes around meeting, like not so long ago, which I find amazing, meeting with Mrs. Verwoerd, the widow of the architect of apartheid. He went to have tea with her. Things that he does in that respect, and that's just one little example, but there are many of these. And the media write very well and extensively about that. But like all medias, I guess they're there to report on mistakes, and they take on the government. I think the media in South Africa today is becoming just a true media that's not trying to do the reconciliation job that the government's supposed to be doing. But I don't think they're making it difficult for the government as far as that's concerned, because they all support it.
Is De Beers a stabilizing force in South Africa?
I guess anybody with that kind of money is always a stabilizing force. Yes, of course, the De Beers company, and it's more than just diamonds. They employ millions of people, and through their social responsibility programs and things, they do a lot for South Africa. I have no doubt about that. And of course, also being in the international community, De Beers themselves is also in our country's interest.
Would you comment upon South African wines, and what is the government doing to encourage their export?
Although I'm a Cape Townian, I do not have a stake in the wine industry, but love to. Yes, excellent wines of the past are even more excellent nowadays, and you're getting them in America. They're freely available, not as freely, obviously, as we would like to see them. It's not so much the government that would promote the export of wine. Obviously, through our Department of Trade and Commerce, we would want to make it as easy as possible for the companies to export their wines. And as far as that's concerned, the government's trying as much as possible to make the playing field for our people in the international market as equal as possible. But our wines are coming into the United States, and I believe that the United States will take as much as we could possibly send here. We're obviously sending, exporting to Europe and other places too. I was just saying before we started here, and I can repeat it, and I hope the press is listening to this, that two of our wines, the ones called Meerlust, 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 you can't forget that, won a gold medal at a wine auction in Chicago just last week, and another Meerlust wine, Meerlust Cabernet Sauvignon, won a second gold medal. So our wines are here, and I guess the people in California better look out.
The comment was that you've remarked that the process of reconciliation is going well. The specific question is on the problem of integration, social integration, which it's suggested might take a long time. How has that been going?
Yes. Yes. If you look at the face of South Africa today, let me refer at the face of the embassy, for instance. Now, granted, that is now government related because we work for the government. But if you look at the face there, how we're trying in the outside world, in our government, to project the true social makeup of South Africa. And in the whole government structure, that's coming through. But that's coming through, in a sense, by force, because that's a government decision. When it comes to social integration in South Africa, it's obviously not forced. But I think if you look at it today and compare it to what it was 10 years ago, you'd be surprised. And it's a natural thing that developed. You could legislate certain rules, but you can't legislate the hearts of people, and that has to come by itself. But I believe with goodwill, and there is goodwill in South Africa, you would see that happening. I think also when the question with respect comes from an American audience, we have to look at the majorities and the minorities, and it's turned around the other way in South Africa. If you look at South Africa going through the streets of Pretoria or Johannesburg, then you would see black South Africans obviously being in the majority and white South Africans mingling with that. So it's happening every day in South Africa. And I think it's a very natural process.
From your perspective as a career Foreign Service officer, what was difficult in the transition during your career of the movement from an apartheid government to the present government?
Honestly, sir, there was nothing difficult about it. It was just very easy, because all of a sudden, as I said this afternoon, when I came in the past into a meeting like this, people would sort of stand away almost if I had body odor. Now I'm no longer, I've been freed by it too in so many respects. No longer do I have to try and convince people that I and my family are not some killing machine that, killed people, and don't care when a small child, no older than my own daughter, get killed in the crossfire between police and protesters. I can now get into a cab in Washington, D.C., and obviously the first thing they ask me, your accent, where's it from? I can say South Africa. In the past, I would have tried maybe Belgium, because if I did tell them South Africa, they would have stopped the cab. It happened to me and asked me to get out. So, but seriously, it really wasn't a difficult transition for us in the Foreign Service. Our lives have become much easier. Now, obviously, the question is, how do I feel personally? First of all, that is a personal question. But what's happening in South Africa, I give my absolute full support. I supported the negotiating process. I believe, somebody asked me the other day, or told me that you're very lucky to have a Nelson Mandela. True, we are. But Mr. Mandela did and is doing what he is doing now because he has the support of South Africans behind him. People would say that de Klerk was a very brave politician, and maybe he was, but he did because he had the support of people behind him. I believe that yes, we're lucky to have a Mr. Mandela, but I also believe that we South Africans deserve a Nelson Mandela. I see myself as one of those South Africans that's supporting what's happening in South Africa, and I, through what I'm doing, will do my very best to help to make a success of the new South Africa, of which I'm very proud.
I don't know why the question was asked specifically, but does South Africa have the equivalent of our Medicare program?
No, we don't have the equivalent. We're working on a national health care program or plan for all South Africans. We have private Medicaid and Medicare in South Africa, and then of course where people cannot afford it, they could go to government hospitals supported by the government where they would get free treatment, if you wish, paying very according to their income. But the South Africans are working on an extensive health plan. Now, if I do look at the problems that other countries have with health care, maybe we shouldn't start, or maybe we should get somebody else to come and help us. But yes, we are working on that seriously because we need that in South Africa. I'm not sure what it's going to look like in the end, but it will hopefully cover all South Africans. And I've got to be careful here again, but I think the Canadian model is something that they're looking seriously at.
Does your new Constitution, or will your new Constitution, the permanent Constitution, guarantee private property?
Yes, the interim one certainly does. And I believe that if you look at the sentiments of the people writing the new Constitution, also the sentiments of South Africans, the interest that civil society has in this, that the final one, my money will be, yes, it will have it. I have very little doubt that it will have it in. Private property will be protected.
The question is, could you describe the relationships between what has been the traditional four social strata in South Africa?
Yes. Let me just say, Mr. Dawes, at the back there that asked the question gave me a little album here with photographs that were taken in 1953 in Cape Town when an American warship, I guess, docked there. And the first thing that caught my eye was the fact that 3 or 4 of the sailors were African Americans. And I told him that I'm sure that was either the first or the last of such a visit to South Africa. But it was 1953, the then South African government objected to the fact that American warship visited Simonstown and that there were black Americans on board, African Americans. And then the American government obviously objected to that. And shortly after that, Americans stopped their fleet visiting Simonstown. So this is very historic, and I'm going to try and find out, and who knows, we may make money. But this is either the first or then the last such a visit to Cape Town. Yes, you know, South Africa, our constitution and our president, our government, our people, our constitution are all working towards a non-racial rather than a multiracial South Africa. We'd like to think of ourselves as non-racial. And the reason for that is that it is true, and we cannot get around it, that they are in South Africa. They're white South Africans, English-speaking descent, Afrikaans or Dutch-speaking descent. They are Indian South Africans from the East Indian continent. They are so-called colored South Africans, people of mixed race. And then the indigenous black South African population. And that population is made up of all different language, ethnic, if you wish, groups. So we cannot deny that, and rather try and make it in, what we're trying to do is to take what's common to all of us and work on that, and try and go for a non-racial society, but not by any means trying to sweep all these other differences under the carpet. And in the best example I can give you again about how it's working in South Africa is to refer you back to the election. There you have, for instance, the colored people that you refer to, the colored South Africans, voted across party lines. A large number supported the National Party. A large number supported the ANC. In fact, my ambassador in Washington, Franklin Son, is from that colored community, and he was the leader of the ANC in the Cape. He's the ambassador now here. The Indian population of South Africa is, again, across the color line as far as the politics are concerned. The Speaker of Parliament I referred to in my speech is Ms. Gingwala. She's a South African of East Indian descent, Speaker, ANC. The Deputy Speaker of the House is Dr. Bandra Ranshot, again East Indian descent, yet National Party member and Deputy Speaker. So you find that in politics in South Africa across the board, and it is slowly but surely working its way through the social stratus of South Africa. Again, that will take time. We have, as you may know, large area that's populated almost exclusively by black South Africans, and in large areas almost exclusively populated by white South Africans. And, people don't move away from their homes overnight, so it's going to take some time. But at least as far as social mixing and all public amenities and places like that, that's totally integrated. And so is schools. I'd love to ask you about that accent, sir. The tax treaty is coming. It's one of the things that we, in fact, are hoping. You may be aware of the Binational Commission, the Gore Mbeki Commission. And one of the things that we, South African government, would like to see is that the tax treaty could possibly be signed in December when Vice President Gore and Deputy President Mbeki sit down for the binational. Now, I think that's most probably a bit starry-eyed and bushy-tailed, but we are working on that thing, and negotiations or talks, discussions are going on almost, on a weekly basis, I'm told. That is the one thing that they would want to push. Then there's, of course, also the bilateral investment agreement that's being worked on. Hopefully between the tax and the investment agreements, it will make things easier. The Americans are investing quite substantial already. Without those two things, of course, it will make it easier for us.
The question is, in your next election, if the disadvantaged have not realized their dreams, will your election be as peaceful as your first election?
Yes, I can't guarantee this, of course. I can't guarantee anything. But I would believe that if you look where we came from, then the chances of a bloody revolution in South Africa was so ripe in the years between 86 and 89, when something like 8,500 people were in fact killed in South Africa in political violence. And this is all now dissipated. I honestly believe that where people now, all people, now have the right to vote for a government, there's no reason why we in South Africa shouldn't follow the example in your country and other democracies where we fight through the ballot and not through the sword. I believe the South Africans will follow that example. Obviously, there are many people that will be dissatisfied, and they are, and that's their right. And by all means, give the government hell and try and keep their feet to the fire, and they're doing that. But I believe the general population in South Africa is no different to populations anywhere else in the world. We want peace. We want to live in peace. We don't want to see our children killed. And I believe you'll see that in South Africa, that our next election will be maybe even more peaceful than the first one.
Is there a national language?
11. No, I tell you what will happen in South Africa. This is one of the things that is being worked out at the moment under the Constitution. But you know, in South Africa, and this maybe partly will answer your question too, that about the violence, that we very fast working at a tradition of negotiations in South Africa, our own tradition, where when things really get tough and we don't know what to do, we negotiate it and somehow we find a solution. Our flag, for instance, there were people fighting that keep the old flag. Others wanted to keep at least the Union Jack in it, and others wanted to keep all sorts of things. And other people said, no, take the ANC colors, as you remember, the yellow, the green, and the blue. And people thought we'd go to war about the flag. And somebody got the brilliant idea, let's get some other designer, I don't know what they call it, commercial designer, to design a flag. They got the flag, we all marched very happily behind that flag, and somebody asked me the other day, what does it mean? And I said, I haven't the faintest idea. and I'm convinced that Mr. Mandela would tell you whatever you want it to mean. And some of that's that mindset of negotiations in South Africa. Now, as far as the languages are concerned, it's also to a certain degree regionally bound. Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, that's where most people speaking Zulu would be from in South Africa. Certain parts of the Western Cape is where you will have predominantly Afrikaans-speaking communities. Eastern Cape, you would have English and Xhosa. So I believe what you will see in the end, all 11 languages in South Africa are official languages. In fact, sign language is an official language in South Africa. And what it means is that somebody insists on having somebody interpret by signs in Parliament, the government's forced to do that. The government will be forced to interpret from English into Xhosa, etc., etc. But because we live in this kind of a society in South Africa with so many people, you'd find in Parliament, for instance, everybody speaks English. There's the odd one that will insist on speaking his own language, and people they sleep in Parliament, so I don't think it makes too much difference. But you can speak in your own language. You can insist on being served in your own language. Most people in South Africa simply use English as the common language. And maybe as far as the newspapers are concerned, again, just to come back to that, that's of course one of the things, the media, where you'd find the SABC being our biggest broadcasting arm of the media, doing most things now in English because it's just easier, it's cheaper, and most people can understand it. So I believe we'll move away from the idea of an official language. We'll have a language of common usage and then 11 or 12 official languages, including sign language. Again, it's regionally determined to a large degree, where you would have certain schools that they would be teaching in Afrikaans because of the community, and because it's an open school, when kids go there, they will be taught in Afrikaans. Other communities will be taught in English and Xhosa and those, depending, especially in the rural. Obviously, in the biggest cities where you have more of a mixture of all these different languages, English, I would imagine, if not already the predominant language of instruction, will certainly become that in the future.
The observation was that while there's been a decrease in political violence, civil violence has increased substantially, and South Africa, it is asserted, has one of, if not the highest murder rate in the world. Would you comment?
That's in fact true. True, first of all, that political violence has come down. Secondly, that criminal violence has escalated, or has escalated. In fact, in the last 6 months, I believe there's again a decrease in the latest figures that came out earlier this month has shown that there's in certain areas 29% decrease, certain areas the lowest being 11% decrease. And then obviously, because our borders have been thrown open, South Africa has been hit by drugs, and drugs bring more crime, etc., etc. And because of the economy, 40% of the people out of formal jobs. It's a huge, big problem. But the government is tackling that and doing the best we can. And I believe it will also turn around as the economy expands and more people are taken up in the economy, and as the police force get a hold on it, simply because they now are being accepted again as a police force and not the enforcer of unjust laws. But may I just say, it's true about the murder capital of the world. That's being said about us. On the other hand, please, if you go to Johannesburg, and that's the city where most people will arrive, if you go to Cape Town, that's the most beautiful city in the world in the southern tip. If you go there you go. If you go there, you would not find yourself in any greater danger or worry than you would find yourself, in all respect, in New York City, most probably Baltimore, or any other big city in the world. That is unfortunately a problem. It's a great big problem wherever we are. I was just in Ottawa, and Ottawa, when I was there in 1992, the crime rate in Ottawa, or murder rate in Ottawa, shot up 100% because 2 people were murdered that year. This year, there's been a remarkable increase in drive-by shooting and things. Now, I'm not trying to say that people are getting worse than they were in 92, but I think it's got to do with the economy. It is a great problem, but what I'm trying to say to you, I don't think you'll be less safe in Johannesburg than you would be in New York City. Try it.
Mr. Ambassador, this has been an extraordinarily informative evening, and one from which I think we've learned a lot, and it's also been very, very enjoyable. So we thank you very much.
Thank you.